Welcome back to day 2 of the Atlantic Air Quality and Health Workshop. Thank you for joining us again. We want to again acknowledge that we live and work on the unsurrendered and unceded traditional lands of the Wolastoq, Mi'kmaq, and Passamaquoddy peoples. This territory is covered by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship, which these nations first signed with the British Crown in 1726. The treaties did not deal with the surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized the Mi'kmaq and Wolastoq title and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. Now, we had some technical errors in recording this morning's sessions, and so the presentations from Angie Hurley at Canada Games and from Lucy Chisholm and Andrew Teakles at Environment and Climate Change Canada are not available in this video format. However, their presentation slides, along with the slides of several other presentations, are available for anyone interested. So please contact us for that information. You can email us at info@nbelong.ca. We will go right into our presentation from Angelos Anastasopolos, who is a senior scientist with the Healthy Environments and Consumer Safety Branch at Health Canada. Please enjoy.
Morning, everybody. I'm here. My name is Angelos Anastasopolos, and from Health Canada, and I'm here to talk about a topic just to kind of round out our discussions. There's been a range of topics over the past couple of days, which is wonderful and amazing. So here we're going to focus just to wind things down on a specific type of source that's urban, which is transportation hubs, and talk a little bit about air quality and also bring in a bit on noise and end with environmental justice. Now, before jumping in further, I just wanted to do something, an important acknowledgement, because I am not with you in the room, but I'm here in Ottawa. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the lands on which many of us live, work, and gather are on the traditional territories of Indigenous nations, and that includes the digital infrastructure that I'm using to speak to everybody there today. I'm located in Ottawa, as I mentioned. On here, it's the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. Their presence here reaches back to time immemorial. I wish to respect this enduring presence and the long-standing ties that Indigenous peoples have to this land where we all reside and flourish, however and whenever each of us may have come and individually settled. Also, in recognition of the many and different territorial lands where each of us might be, because we're dialed in from various places, of course, to this conference, I encourage everybody attending here today to learn more about the territory on which each of us lives. So with that, I thought we would kind of start here by, let's see, here we are. Okay, perfect. I thought we'd start the topic by just really zooming out and saying, okay, so we're going to talk about these freight transportation hubs. Why are we even interested in this? Is this something that's worth looking at? How does it differ from other topics that we've looked at as exposure researchers? So the really big picture is when we're talking about freight transportation, so moving goods basically from one part of the country to another, even into our country and then right to our door. Freight transportation is increasing with population growth. More people, more stuff needs to move around, get to the people, or go between people. So it kind of makes sense. And what that might mean is that increasingly freight transportation could be a substantial source of local air pollution. And the other aspect, and the key one that I think we focus on as exposure researchers at Health Canada, is that the transportation infrastructure for these freight locations, whether they be freight hubs, logistics centers, Amazon warehouses, the things we're going to talk about today, rail yards, for example, of course, these can be urban. They're not something that's just kind of somewhere and we don't kind of interact with it. They can be literally embedded within neighborhoods in some locations, and there seem to be some land use trends that increasingly are closing those distances between where we live, work, and play, and where these more intense transportation hubs can be. And so our research goal was to characterize air quality for Canadians who are living near these types of intensive transportation infrastructure. So that's kind of the big picture as to why we're looking at this. So how did we go about it? Well, in our research group at Health Canada and with my collaborators as well in academia, we do various exposure studies. Now, in this case, the studies were focused on transportation, as of course we mentioned, and they were local neighborhood scale research studies. We're really interested in what the air quality is like within locations near these facilities. And the two facilities that I'm going to talk about today, we have other studies as well that I'm happy to speak after the presentation about or outside of this forum. But we're going to talk here about today about a study looking at a freight rail yard and a study that's looking at an intermodal yard, which is a truck to rail hub. And we'll talk about what that means. And one last thing before we get into some of the details here is sometimes we're asked, okay, what's the point of this research? Well, there's a lot of positive impacts from collecting real world data within places where people live and work and play and raise their children. And that data can inform various things. You can see the bullets here, but it's anything from improving health risk assessments by making them more specific to locations and subpopulations, to improved health messaging, to policy instruments, which sometimes we think, oh, it's this big wonky word, and what does it really mean? But in this case, it could be regulating these sources. It could be changing the setback guidelines, or at least ensuring that they're well understood. It could be improving land use planning, transportation network design, mitigation measures for the specific communities or ones like them that we look at. And the last point we'll get into at the tail end of the presentation, it can definitely inform environmental justice and right to a healthy environment, which, as we all know, has now been recently enshrined in law and within SEPA. And so a big responsibility and a big part of how we do science going forward. So we'll talk about that as well. So the last kind of important item I wanted to acknowledge is the collaborations that we have, the research, the specific studies I'm going to show today and talk about today. We're in collaboration with a number of folks and organizations, and you can see them listed here. We work, of course, across the levels of government, right down to municipal, where it's appropriate. And we work with academic partners, and the ones to really focus here, as you can see, University of Toronto, and Toronto Metropolitan University and University of Rochester Medical Center for some additional expertise. So with that, let's get into our first study that I wanted to talk about and here even present some of our findings here. So this study was an urban exposure study of a freight rail yard. Now, again, you can kind of sense I'm a big believer in kind of setting the context as to why we're looking at this source. What's interesting about rail yard emissions and freight rail yard emissions in particular. So let's kind of pick that apart a little bit. There's a few things that are worth mentioning that make this an interesting source, and it's a source that hasn't been well studied in Canada in particular. And so this is why we go and we collect some data on it. So the first thing that's interesting about it is these locations, these freight rail yards, as you'd imagine, are locations of intense source activity. So what do I mean by that? I mean that the yard operates around the clock and it operates all day, like every day of the week. There's no weekend break, and it operates year round. There's no seasonal break because freight always has to be moved. There's always a demand for that. And so CN Rail, CP Rail, they're operating these yards intensely around the clock. The other point is a very interesting one that's unique to freight rail yards. So the locomotives within freight rail yards, they're freight locomotives, and they live their lives within that yard. Their whole point is to assemble and disassemble the trains, shunting of the rail cars, and put together the trains. And then it's a different locomotive that comes, hitches up, and then pulls that, a line haul locomotive, it's called. And then that will bring the train between destinations. So these freight locomotives, their job and their design for this is to be just big, grunty workhorses within the yard for their entire lives. They have long service lives on the order of decades. And that's where things get interesting, because kind of analogous to if we think about even like the cars, cars and trucks that most of us drive as just getting around on roads, the older the vehicle, that means it likely has a lower emissions regulation, a lower tier of emission certification, and therefore, generally speaking, older vehicles are going to pollute more, even if they're legal and within limits. The limits are set higher in the past than they are with more recent vehicles. And that's the same situation with freight locomotives. They are definitely regulated in terms of the emissions that they can emit. They're diesel powered, of course. But older locomotives would have been regulated under a lower emission certification tier. And that means, generally speaking, unless they've been upgraded, they will be polluting more than a newer one. Now, there's fleet renewal, of course, that occurs. But again, because these machines can operate and do their function for a very long time, it tends to be a little bit slow. And so we still have in Canada and in other countries, of course, too, quite a number of 20, 30, close to 40-year-old locomotives. There's still a number of these operating. So that's an interesting kind of particularity of freight rail yards. And the last item is that there's idling emissions, because as you can imagine, this big diesel engine doesn't like to just be like shut off and turned on the way you could do with like a passenger vehicle. So in the winter, especially, and of course we have in a lot of places in Canada cold winters. This winter is definitely one of these really cold ones. So they tend to be allowed to idle for long periods of time for functional, practical reasons, of course. And that also means there's additional emissions over the course of the day. Now, the other thing that makes freight rail yards and freight locomotives and the sources within a rail yard interesting is the number of emissions. The profile of their emissions is very complex. There's a lot of things going on. So I've broken it down here, like first in terms of sources, we have diesel exhaust. We have, and of course that means diesel exhaust particulate, DEP, which we know already is classified by WHO and recognized here in Canada as well. It has health risk. It is a carcinogen. So that on its own is already an issue, and we're just getting rolling. We have also emissions coming from another source because it's a rail, it's a train. You have all kinds of friction on the rails, steel wheels on steel rails. You have the brake pads. So you have all these non-exhaust emissions, just as we're becoming familiar with their importance for on-road vehicles. It's even more the case with big, heavy rolling stock and a locomotive dragging these things along. So there's a lot of these friction and abrasion emissions that are generated as particulate matter. And then you also have, it's a large, large area and it's unpaved, and therefore you're going to have really easy resuspension for things to be kicked up. So even things that even the combustion components and the wear components, if they settle within the yard, they can very easily, with wind effects or even movement, be resuspended and then move again into surrounding areas. Now, the pollutants, again, they're also complex. So because of these sources, we were looking at the effects of gaseous pollutants like nitrogen oxides. We're looking at particulate matter in multiple size fractions. The smaller size fractions, we talk a lot about PM 2.5 because it's respirable, fine particulate matter, and it has demonstrated health effects, and there is no safe threshold for concentration of PM 2.5. But we should also keep in mind the even smaller size fractions down to the ultrafine particulate, which are PM 0.1 microns in comparison to the 2.5. Those, of course, go even further into the body, and they can cross directly into the bloodstream and then have systemic deposition. So it's an additional consideration. Now, the other thing to mention is that PM 2.5, or particulate matter generally, it's composed of a whole bunch of elements on it and components on it. So we've got the carbon, which is what we think of because it can be combustion generated in the case of diesel, but you have elements, you have metals. Some of those have health risks. You have air toxics. We're going to talk a little bit about air toxics and specifically PAHs, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, in a couple of slides because we've had some interesting results there. And then I want to mention that there's also noise. In another version of this slide deck, I didn't want to chance it here, but there's a video that I can click on and you can hear what we recorded at the rail yard. And it's, of course, as you imagine, as I'm sure you've experienced, when you're near a rail crossing even, let alone a yard, It's like squealing and grinding and just metallic sounds. It's extremely noisy. There's low vibration sounds as well, and even like vibration of the earth. And so that's often what communities who are near these locations, that's usually the first thing that's on their mind. It's like, wow, it's noise pollution, it's noise stresses, that has its own health risks. But here it's combined with, of course, all the air pollutants that we're interested in particular. And those two together can be a co-stressor because after all, that's how our body experiences the environment. It experiences multiple stressors at once. Now, the other aspect, and then we'll move on, the really important one is all of these things about this source are a big deal, but they're particularly a big deal because these locations can be located near neighborhoods, near communities. And that seems to be a trend where land use trends, because of some very good reasons like mixed use zoning, densification, and maybe some less good land use reasons like inevitable sprawl, has brought communities closer and closer in some cases to certain of these facilities, even rail yards. And so with that, that's kind of the big picture as to why this is interesting, what's unique about freight. Let's have a look now at the specific one that we studied. So you can see here, it's in Ontario, it's in Toronto, the big, large metropolis of Toronto, big sprawling metropolis of Toronto. It's in East Toronto, this particular yard. There's a number of yards in Toronto, but this freight rail yard is in East Toronto and Scarborough, for those that know the area. It's a CP rail yard. It's a freight marshalling yard. It operates, as we mentioned, like other yards around the clock. And the capacity of the yard, what it tends to assemble in terms of trains, about 15 trains in a given day, and even overnight, just to kind of demonstrate that they're very busy overnight because they do about 7 trains in the overnight hours. So very busy operation. And the other thing, at a glance, before we move on from this slide, I just want everybody to have a look here at how these are residential neighborhoods. This is obviously a Google Map photo. And even on this side, you start to see them. They're a little bit further away, but they get quite close over here. And that's kind of the story here, that we have a real close proximity of some of these, of this neighborhood and this neighborhood to this facility here. Now, let's look a little more carefully at what that looks like. So what this photo is showing here is, again, it's the Google Maps view. I've zoomed in here and cropped it a bit so you can see the fence line right here where I'm showing the red line of the yard. And now this is the exact same image, just zoomed in so that we can really get a sense of what this community looks like and others around the yard elsewhere. It just happened this is the closest one. So what we want to notice here is that some of these, how close are some of these homes? Well, some of them are actually within 150 meters of the rail yard fence line. So it's basically about a block and you're there, you're at the yard. And in other cases, even when you say, oh, well, how about here? It's a bit further. Okay, well, that's only 300 meters or so. It's really not very far away from the yard, half a kilometer. Definitely, it's definitely their neighbor, along with other neighbors here. Now, the other point I wanted to make is that there's multiple uses here that we could point out. So there's a long-term care home, a hospice. It's actually just off the photo up here, but it's within 300 meters of the yard. We have multiple schools. You can see one right here. You can see another one right here, a public school, a Catholic school. You can see the big green space here, parks, smaller parks and various parkettes. You have churches, you have community centers. The point I'm trying to make, and I think you can make it clearly if you look at this photo, this is one of the streets. I just grabbed one and just did a street view image just to get a sense of what it looks like. This is familiar to a lot of us. This is a typical urban, suburban street, tree lined in this case, single detached homes, multi-unit homes. You can see one here. In other words, the point is that this is like a neighborhood like a lot of others, where it has the amenities, the community, and the relationships that a lot of us live in and appreciate. The difference is that this also has the rail yard as one of the land uses within the neighborhood, or at least very close to the neighborhood. And before jumping ahead, I also want to note that this icon I put here, to not single any specific facility out, it's just a placeholder, looks like a little manufacturing facility or a small factory. I put it here to remind us that, in fact, if you poke around the map and look at the pollutant release inventory and PRI inventory, there are some other sources as well. That's the other interesting thing about rail yards, is they tend to attract other industrial and commercial facilities around them, whether it's because they're assembling something or logistics functions. And so you tend to get this concentration of transportation and even sometimes industry-focused sources within or very near these neighborhoods. So with that, let's now look at what type of sampling design that we used. So the field sampling that we did, given this type of context and land use, we set up 2 stations, one on each side of the yard. The goal here was to get very close to the yard with one site, and then to have a contrast site further afield. And that's exactly what we did. This one site is within about 100 meters of the yard, in like a church parking lot, in fact. And there we collected data for about a little over a year at the near source site, and then at the contrast site, so the 2 sites together, about 6 months. Now in the box, I won't read them, but you can see the pollutants that we sampled. So we set up a fairly comprehensive monitoring station for air pollutants. We also carried out a noise sampling campaign where we put noise monitors throughout the community, and we did this in 2 seasons to catch some seasonal variability and other contrasts within the year. Now, we did this in 2020 through to early 2021. Now, if that sounds familiar, yes, it sounds both very recent and also a long time ago, which is kind of the effects for all of us of thinking to the pandemic. So I can tell you, we set up this first station, like a lot of other researchers. 2020 started like a fairly normal year. It was the first week of March. We finished setting up the station with our collaborators at University of Toronto. And then we were going to come back soon afterwards and set up a second site. We were collaborating with city officials to find a good location and so on. All this was happening. And then all of a sudden, within days of setting up this location, luckily it was our primary site, the pandemic came in officially, shutdown started. That meant the university, we couldn't get into the university, the students couldn't get to the equipment. We couldn't, of course, meet with the city because there were far more consequential day-to-day things to worry about, which was keeping people safe through the pandemic. And what did that mean? That meant we had to do some kind of a pivot. So we were ultimately able to set up the site later in the year, but the pivot we did was with my colleague at University of Toronto, Dr. Marianne Hadzopoulou. We incorporated mobile scanning, mobile monitoring, which was this little photo of the car here. This is actually the vehicle that is used. So it has various air pollutant sensors on it, as well as GPS trackers and trackers and cameras. And we drove the vehicle on a sampling campaign on all kinds of streets, including parking it and waiting for a while, getting some data. So that gave us an additional data set that we're working through now. So that's what the sampling study looked like. So now let's just look at some findings, because at the end of the day, this study we have been able to, was a while ago now, so we have been able to work through the data sets and look at them, analyze them. And we have a few highlights. I won't get into everything. There's a paper here that I mentioned here. This is a forthcoming paper. It's in submitted to Transportation Research Part D, which is a journal that does a lot of transportation-focused environmental research work. And so that was a suitable place. So I'll be happy to keep everyone updated when that actually is published in the literature, and then share the link. But we can certainly go through some highlights right now. So the first thing we found that the rail yard was indicated by some of the pollutants when we stratified them by direction and when we stratified them by time. We're talking about the spatial temporal trends. Now, I mentioned early on about the rail yard works all days of all hours of the day, and that's important. So if we look at this plot, and this is one of the few that I'm going to put up, I promise. This again, it's the rail yard. It's the location that I'm showing data for here, the primary close near source site. And this is a polar annulus plot. What this is doing, it's showing concentrations of a pollutant. In this case, it's our ultrafines, our very fine particles that can penetrate very deep, including into the bloodstream. So this is a particle count. And this is stratified by wind direction, as well as by time. If you see the little hash marks, these are like 4-hour increments through a 24-hour day. So what's interesting here is that it confirms that the rail yard is impacting the levels within the neighborhood at the monitor that we set up. We know that because, first of all, the hotspots are in the direction of the rail yard. And then someone might play devil's advocate, and it's a very good question, and say, okay, that's true. I can see those hotspots lined up with the rail yard, but I also think that there's other sources in the same direction as the rail yard. Of course, this is a city. There's large roads. There's other sources, as we showed. That's very true. The other interesting thing, though, that improves the corroboration here is we look at time of day. There's this hotspot here that I'm showing you. This hotspot and even the tail end of this hotspot here, those are the overnight hours. And in the overnight hours, it is clearly, again, aligned with the rail yard, but also those are hours, we're talking 1 in the morning, 2 in the morning, midnight, where there's not a lot of traffic. The roads, even the major roads have greatly attenuated. We know that from looking at traffic data, including specifically here. And yet the rail yard is an active source. And the story here is that we see that in the pollutant measurements that we got. Now, the other highlight is, okay, so some of the pollutants, clearly the rail yard is influencing. That makes sense. We were able to demonstrate it. So what are those levels like for major pollutants compared to other places? Well, we found for a couple of the pollutants that are criteria contaminants, they're monitored, they're reported. This is specifically NO2, and for PM2.5, we found that the levels in the rail yard neighborhood, when we compared them to other residential locations nearby, but not having a big busy area like this near it, the rail yard, we saw that yes, indeed, the levels are higher in the rail yard neighborhood than other residential areas. The greatest difference, of course, as you can imagine, is in overnight. The overall daytime average, a little bit higher. But when you look at the overnight block of hours, it's significantly higher in the rail yard neighborhood. So again, that makes sense, and it was a highlight. Now, another finding where we're really starting to get interesting, I think, here is we looked at the composition of the particulate matter of these fine particles. And here I'm stealing shamelessly, because I haven't put the credit up here, but it was from that YouTube video that our first speaker yesterday presented. And I grabbed it because it kind of shows in a cartoon form that particulate matter is made up of a whole bunch of components. And some of those components that are of interest to us are the elements, the metals, and also PAHs, which are also carcinogenic. So here, let's look very quickly at the elements and the metals. These are very interesting because they can point out or confirm certain source types. And in fact, when we looked at which metals and elements were enriched within the PM compared to other locations, other NAPS locations, monitoring locations that we looked at, we saw that the rail yard levels were enriched in various metals, and those metals seemed to be consistent with what we thought. Fossil fuel combustion sources, including diesel engine, friction and abrasion, wheels, rails, the brake pads. So we saw elevated barium, elevated iron, as you'd imagine. We saw elevated sulfur, indicating like combustion. We saw elevated potassium. Again, that's in oil, lubricants, and expected again. So we saw these things. And we also saw a lot of elements like calcium and silica, which are like soil. So we expected that because, as I mentioned, and the photo reminds us, it's a very large unpaved area. So you have a lot of resuspension. So that kind of confirmed that the PM2.5 levels are a little bit higher in the rail yard neighborhood than other locations, but they're also different than other locations because they have more of these elements that are consistent with these sources, such as diesel combustion and abrasion of metals and so on. Now, the health considerations to this, a couple of things to mention really quickly. First is, as I mentioned, the size fraction. We only quantified the metals and the elements for PM2.5, but others who have looked at the same type of analysis, but for the ultrafine particles, were able to see similar enrichment in similar species. And what does that mean? That confirms that if we're seeing it in PM2.5, these enriched metals, then they also exist likely in the finer size fraction. And that is an issue because it, as I mentioned, can go directly into the bloodstream and then have an increased risk of systemic deposition for these species, some of which can carry a health risk. And the other thing to mention is iron. When we think of a rail yard, we think of rusty rails, and in some cases, you even see it on cars that are parked nearby, little iron particles. So some of this iron could be in oxidized form, and specifically a form known as magnetite. And magnetite, and this has been shown, again, we did not look at the oxidative state of the iron that we measured. You actually need a much bigger sample and a different study design to do that. So we weren't able to do that here, but we can rely on the literature here, both some work we've done ourselves within our group. My colleague, Dr. Van Rijswijk, has looked at subway particulate matter and was able to get oxidative state of the iron. And also other researchers that have looked at it elsewhere near rail yards, they found similar results. They confirm that some of this iron, even a substantial amount of it, is as magnetite. Why is that an issue? Because magnetite has been shown to have oxidative stress effects in lung tissue. So it is a specific oxidative state of iron that carries health risks. So that's also a consideration here in a complexity. And now let's talk about something that I think is a real high-level kind of takeaway, which is the air toxics. So again, I'm showing that same image here because just to remind us all, PAHs, not all of us are familiar here in the room with what this class of compounds is. In a nutshell, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, that's what it stands for. They're a class of compounds, the most famous of which is benzoate pyrene. They're like benzene rings, if you imagine like C6H6, for those of us that remember that chemistry. They're benzene rings, which benzene itself is a carcinogen, that have been polymerized. They're in various chain lengths and different shapes. And as a class, as well as in many cases individually, these are classified under SEPA as a toxic class of compounds. Specifically, they have carcinogenicity properties for some of these species. And the other thing to mention here, and they exist in both vapor phase and particle phase. The phase that tends to have the greater toxicity tends to be species that are largely particle phase. And that's why I show them here. It's the PM2.5 or the PM component that is PAHs that we're particularly interested here because those seem to be the species that carry greater toxicity. So with that kind of like quick primer, we measured a series of species, and the way to, because you have a number of species, what often we do is we aggregate the species together to get a single measure of, well, what are the PAH levels? So we have, for example, total PAH, in this case for 15 species summed. And we have also something known as BAP equivalent toxicity. So BAP, that's benzoate pyrene, that's the index species that has been the most studied by toxicologists and really demonstrated as having carcinogenicity. And then it's accepted as the reference species, if you will, and other PAHs are indexed to that species. They can be less toxic than BAP or they can be more toxic than BAP. And therefore you can do a weighted aggregation, a weighted sum, and you get a sense of what is the overall toxicity for the species that we looked at. So what we found is the total PAHs and even also the total BAP equivalent toxicity, the levels in the rail yard neighborhood were statistically significantly higher than two sites that we specifically chose to look at, We compared to a highway influence site in Toronto. You can kind of see it here. It's the third kind of set of bars here on the bar plot. And we also compared it, and so that itself is already an interesting finding because it's like that highway site, I just want to stress, it's next to the 401. There are up to 16 lanes of traffic. It is an intense site, and this monitor at that site, operated by Environment Canada, it's set there for a very specific reason to give a real understanding of what intense traffic emissions are like. It's set within meters of the edge of the roadway. And so we found even higher levels than that location. So that's already interesting. And then we said, well, let's compare this to an industry influence site because PHs are often thought of, traffic is a big source, any combustion source is, wood smoke is a source, another. But so are certain industries. And so nearby in the Greater Toronto area, you have in Hamilton, you have iron and steel manufacturing. And so in downtown Hamilton, the Environment Canada site there measures PAHs, so we were able to make a comparison. And we found the levels, at least in the winter period, you can see now on the right here for the benzoapyrene equivalent toxicity. In the winter period, they were higher than even the industry site. In the summer period, they were not statistically significantly higher, at least at 5% significance, but still getting there. But in the winter, clearly higher. And that's really quite an interesting finding because Hamilton is a location that historically has very high pHs in Canada. It's one of the locations, historically at least, it was usually the second highest location in the NAPS monitoring network. And so here we're showing that locally, you can have pH levels even higher than this downtown industry influenced location or next to a very busy highway. So again, not to scare anyone here, this is about understanding and characterizing the real world situation of neighborhoods, including neighborhoods that are next to these sources. And so it is an interesting takeaway finding. And so again, happy to update when the journal paper comes out. Now with that, a last point here on the noise, because I mentioned we also looked at noise. Now this is our collaboration with my colleague at Toronto Metropolitan University, Dr. Tori Engel. And he ran this noise campaign at the same time that we set up all the monitors. You can see in the small inset, the buffers and some of the monitor locations that he set up. The takeaways here are that, yes, as expected, the noise levels in the rail yard neighborhood were higher than comparison locations elsewhere, typical residential within specifically Toronto, because Tor had done a study previously for bigger parts of Toronto, so was able to compare. So indeed, it is noisier as you might expect. And also in a noise model, it was able to confirm, the model confirmed that as you get closer to the rail yard, it gets louder, and as you go further, it gets less loud. And the use of that, it seems again obvious, but it confirms that the rail yard itself is a source of this increased noise. And that's even after controlling for other sources, including the major highway and the major roads that are nearby. And the last point here, you can read yourselves for those interested. We sampled noise and analyzed it as both dBA weighting scale, which is typically close to how the human ear perceives sound. And that's what most guidelines are written around. But we also sampled in dBC weighting scale, which actually puts more weight on the lower frequencies. We did that quite intentionally because a rail yard source has the rumbling diesel locomotives. It has pulling of heavy cars. Residents often, this is what they complain about. It's the low frequency and the shaking that they complain. And so we found actually, yes, that the DBC weighting scale was also useful. It showed some sensitivity in the model to the rail yard source location. So that's it for rail yards. Let's now get into a little more quickly a study that is actually happening right now. It's a new study. And this is a truck to rail hub. And let's look at what that looks like. I want to say I'm giving everyone a chance to look at this photo, but I also just want to take a sip of water, or coffee in this case. So we're looking here at an artist rendering, obviously an artist rendering of the specific hub that's going to be built. It's being built right now, in fact, in Milton, Ontario. Now, Milton, I don't have an inset shown here, but it's outside of Toronto. It's very near, for those that know Ontario. It's very near the small town of Guelph, Waterloo. You're kind of headed southwestern Ontario a little bit, but it's also close enough to Toronto that a lot of people have increasingly said, "Oh, I think I want to live in Milton." It's this charming little town, then it turns into a small city, and then it starts to grow. So it's this interesting community that is rapidly growing. And in Milton, CN Rail is building this intermodal hub, this truck to rail hub. And the photo kind of says what the intent is for these hubs. The goal of these hubs is trucks will come to the hub, and their freight is going to be pulled off the trailer, I should say, that's the word I'm looking for, and then with these cherry pickers, and then plucked onto a train. The train is assembled, and when the train has long enough for a given destination and enough cars going there, then a train is going to pull this out and through Milton. We'll look in a second what that looks like. And the close-up kind of really shows this is real world. What it comes down to is the little cherry picker cart comes over and basically relieves the 18-wheeler that brought this into this central location, this hub, and then is going to stack it and then in time put it onto a train that logistically, you can imagine the complexity of this operation. It's quite incredible from that perspective too. So this is kind of how the operation looks. Now let's look at what that really might mean for air quality, and we'll look in a second at what the study design looks like. So I mentioned where Milton is, so we'll skip that. But it's the local impacts that we're curious here about and interested in looking at. And what we want to mention is we've been talking a lot about rail, and this is still very much a facility where the point is to get this freight onto a train, and then the train heads off. But the less obvious thing, but maybe in other perspective, the more prominent thing is actually the trucks. All the trucks have to come to this hub. So how many trucks are we talking about here? Well, the design capacity of this facility is up to 800 trucks a day. Every one of these trucks has to come into Milton or around Milton. We'll see the map in a second. And then it has to leave after it's dropped off its load. And so you're looking at 1,600 truck trips that currently are not there. Of course, there's trucks coming through Milton, but this is a new induced demand, in a sense, you could look at it that way, for an additional up to 800 trucks coming to this small community or town. And the number of trains is going to increase as well for trains. So you've got this increase in trains, a really big increase in diesel powered. In most cases, they're of course still diesel powered on the roads, 18-wheelers. That's the interesting thing. That is a very big change that's happening right now, or it's going to happen when the hub gets set up and starts operating. Now, the last thing to mention here is the context. There's a very broad set of stakeholders that for years, in fact, were opposed to the hub. As not everyone here is familiar with this issue, we don't need to get into it, but as some of you may suspect or imagine, there was resistance locally, even at the municipal and the regional level, multiple municipalities, against this hub being built in this specific location. And that meant active litigation. That litigation is something that was one of the things that we had to, of course, navigate as we set up looking at what air quality is like in this community. What it really matters, though, is the stakeholders. So that meant a lot of stakeholders, a range of them. So the public first and foremost, both individuals as well as advocacy groups. You have all the levels of government. And as I mentioned, some of those local levels have been very publicly opposed, including in litigation against the hub. You have First Nations community. It's not just one, it's actually, I think, 5, if I remember correctly, First Nations with territories that are within this broader area. So even though you have one First Nation right where the hub is being built with territory there, it's a larger region that is being influenced and therefore multiple First Nations territories that are interested and have a share in terms of concern for this hub. So that's an additional important consideration. You have the Conservation Authority. You have, of course, industry itself, in this case, the people operating the rail. So all this makes it a very complex study. And again, all the more reason why it's important to see what there is to see, what's going to happen. So this is what the field sampling looks like. We still have a little more time here. So this is what the field sampling looks like that we've set up. And the details you don't need to worry so much about at this point. What matters is what I show here on the right, that we had the opportunity here to do a before and after study design. The hub is right now not built, it's being built, but we were able to get in and sample what air quality is like in and around Milton before the hub is built. And we're going to return after the hub is operating at capacity, or let's say near capacity, representative conditions with the trucks moving and so on. And that allows us to then do a comparison. But even the before data set is of interest to us as exposure scientists, as health scientists, because a lot of the data that's been collected over the years and studied tends to be in larger cities, and for good reason, because there's a lot of population there and the issues are complex. But we haven't as often looked at smaller cities such as this one, this town of Milton, and that itself is interesting. So at a glance, you can see that we set up 5 locations within the city, including the NAPS location, where we added more equipment to the NAPS monitor that's there. We also set up a local background monitor, very important for our comparison years later when we go back. And we also relying here a little more heavily on our mobile sampling, which drove the truck routes and other small neighborhood roads all through the town. So we have a really good ability to do a very good land surface or a spatial map of what levels are like along all those roads. So I said that we've done this. Well, we've done the pre. We've been able to go out and collect the data. Here's some photos of the field work. You can see here the people here. That's kind of, it always comes down to the people. And so you can see my colleague there, Dr. Matt Adams, and my colleague at Health Canada, Ryan Kulka, our lead engineer and like equipment lead. And then you can see a couple of our students as well. And so this field work has been done. The analysis is literally in progress right now, like as in this week, this quarter type thing. And I have here a website that I'll also paste, or one of my colleagues might put into the chat. This is a website that talks about this project and the project I just spoke about, the rail yard study. And it also introduces another study we did of aircraft landing and takeoff emissions that my colleague, Dr. Van Rijswijk, led. And so there's a range of information. And also on that page, there's links to other health information that might be of interest to a lot of folks here. Now, I didn't want to end this, and thanks to all of you for being a little bit patient on time here. I think we're good. I really want to take a few minutes here and talk about environmental justice considerations, because maybe some of you have already been thinking this as you've been looking at the maps of the homes near these facilities. And if not, then maybe after this, all of us will be. So some considerations. And I'm going to preface this by saying we have not done an environmental justice analysis of these data sets that I've presented yet. But it's important, I think, to show that some of the issues that and the considerations that are relevant here, because as I mentioned early on, we all have now a responsibility as scientists and researchers looking at environmental health to consider right to a healthy environment and to consider these types of issues. And in other work that I've done with some colleagues, we've been looking specifically at environmental justice issues in other communities within this general area. So without talking about these specifics yet, some things are worth mentioning as kind of general considerations. So the first one is that when you have neighborhoods near this type of intense transportation infrastructure, it could even be industry, it could be both, in fact, they may be experiencing higher or more toxic air pollution exposures. We saw that with some of our results. They seem to be suggesting that the levels of some pollutants are higher there. Maybe not surprising, maybe surprising. Other studies have shown this. When we look at spatial maps, we see the hotspots in various parts of a city. So we know that there's inequalities in a given space, an urban space. But where those inequalities also line up with a community that has a high degree of marginalization, what do we mean by that? There's multiple indices that go into a marginalization index, but we're talking, for example, like financial resources, like socioeconomic status, to use an old term. We're talking about levels of education. We're talking about percent of visible minorities in an area versus another area. We're talking about all these things that we know systemically lead to less access, less mobility, less agency. And so when you have a community that has higher marginalization by one or more of these metrics that exist, and it also has higher air pollution, well, that's when the inequality becomes an inequity. That's when we really start to get concerned, if we're concerned about justice and fairness, which of course, as I mentioned, we are. The other thing to mention briefly is we talk a lot about air pollution, and we also introduce the idea that there's noise. So there's these other stressors, and they can be experienced together. And when you start thinking about a marginalized population or subpopulation or a community, then other cofactors start to become important. For example, behaviors or access to air cleaners. Maybe they're less in a marginalized community than they would be in a less marginalized community. Well, now you combine less access to air cleaners or higher prevalence of smoking with higher outdoor air pollution levels, and that now just adds to that potential health risk. And you also have pre-existing conditions, comorbidities. So we know that in many cases, marginalized communities, especially even certain ethnic groups, have a higher incidence of certain disease. Well, you consider that alongside their being exposed to higher levels of air pollution compared to other non-marginalized communities, and that suddenly is something that is really a serious consideration. The third point is that a community that is marginalized and disproportionately impacted by air pollution, it may also have reduced agency. And what do I mean by that? Well, a good example is if we think of a community that it doesn't have the economic people, at least individuals in that community, may have lower socioeconomic status. They cannot easily move. So if you say, oh, well, your levels are higher here, why don't you just go to another neighborhood that has lower air pollution? That is not an option for a lot of Canadians for the reasons that we're talking about, many of which are systemic, historical systemic reasons. But there's also social reasons. It isn't just, oh, well, you don't have the money, let's fix that. There's social reasons. People make choices. So people choose their neighborhoods for a lot of reasons, and it's not only because of what they can afford or not afford. So they could have family there. They could have their church there. They could have access to healthcare facilities there. So for all these reasons, it may not be an option to easily move. And what does that translate to? That may mean that there's reduced agency, and that's a consideration. The last point is just maybe a simple one. It's that these types of issues, environmental justice issues, marginalization issues, they're not static. They may change over time. So they can change I thought about breaking it into two ways here. First of all, the land use can change. So a neighborhood that is marginalized but maybe didn't have big transportation sources or busyness near it, that can all of a sudden get worse, the air pollution aspect. It could go the other way. It could get better as locations deindustrialize. But you also could have demographics changes where a neighborhood can become more marginalized or less marginalized. And the example that a lot of us know is the term of gentrification. And the last thing that I think I'll stop on this is there's kind of an ethical complexity with environmental justice considerations. The shortest way to put it is to think of an example of gentrification. So gentrification, you have a neighborhood that may have been on the whole like lower, like more marginalized, but all of a sudden things start to change. There's business investment, there's homes being built, there's infill, homes are replaced, and all of a sudden you have less marginalized individuals coming in and a vibrancy. Usually it's seen as a very good thing, and generally from some metrics it is. But often gentrification, what we've seen, what my colleagues that have looked at this have seen, is that it can also lead to locally increased air pollution levels. So because there's more cars and there's more activity happening and more movement with private vehicles and so on. So for this specific example, we can ask the question, who is driving those changes? The gentrification? Okay, it tends to be people that are coming there that have more resources, who are less marginalized. And then let's contrast to who is being impacted disproportionately. It's the people who were there before, who were the initial neighborhood and what that makeup looked like. They're both going to experience now an increase in air pollution locally, but some of those people they weren't the individual reason why it happened, but certainly the other folks, they did not have any factor in this. It just happened to them. And again, it ties back to the agency. It's a very subtle point, but it's one that I think as we get into this type of research, we need to start thinking about untangling this, especially when we interact with the communities themselves. And with that, thank you, and I'll be happy to take some questions. And thanks for sitting through all this and to the end of the presentation, basically.
Thank you, Angelos, for your time and your presentation. I mean, I think my baseline for freight information was basically at zero. So I certainly learned a lot. We definitely have time for a question or maybe two. Does anybody have a question here in the room? Oh, we have Beverly up at the front.
Thank you for that excellent presentation. I sure learned a lot, and it made me think quite a bit about what's on in New Brunswick, what's gone on in New Brunswick in the past, specifically about local communities being asked or forced to accept environmental or health risks, but not necessarily getting the benefits that come with some of these industrial or um, hubs like you were talking about. So
Yeah. Mhm.
one of my questions, or maybe comment, or both, is the study that you're doing with the new hub that's coming on. I think that's a CN hub. Who's paying for that? Is CN paying for that? Because they should be.
Okay. Yeah, the study we're doing in the Milton study, that's our study. That's Health Canada. So that's our Health Canada funded study. Now, your point is a good one about is CN involved? They are involved as part of the impact assessment process. It was a very long, dragged out over many years because of the litigation, and we're outside of that as kind of health scientists, Health Canada representing kind of this other interest, which we think is the public's interest, of course. But they have set up monitors, and maybe I'll actually go back here really quickly to, can I do this? Yes, I can. Okay. So yeah, this is the best way to answer you is if you look, if you look at these two icons, I put like a little train. I guess I was feeling kind of funny at that time when I chose that icon. So those are monitor locations very close to the hub property, and those are set up by CN Rail, and they're required to they've been operating even before they started or just before they started, all through construction, and they need to be kept up for, I'm not sure how long after, but I believe for quite some time. And we've been told that in addition to the data that we're collecting, we have a slightly different focus. We want to actually get right into the community and go right along even the roads that the trucks will be driving on. But we've been told that we will have sharing of the data they've been collecting as well, because it is meant to be available to the public, and therefore it's also can be available to ourselves here at Health Canada. So they do have involvement there.
Thank you. I guess in some ways it is annoying to me that our taxpayers' dollars pays for this when yeah, I think it should be the industry paying for it, but whatever. When I look at your results, my mind always goes to mitigation. So these
Excellent.
results are very important. Without data, we can't tell a story, right? And we have impressions, and I don't think anybody's surprised maybe by your results. I'm not, but we need that data to prove it because we can't speak to, well, maybe in this day and age we can speak to opinion, but like normally as scientists we want to speak to data. But my mind goes to mitigation. So what's the next, and then maybe this might be outside what you're doing. It probably is, but if you can speak to it, how do we
Mhm.
mitigate? Like, if we know this is happening, especially in some of these already established neighborhoods, how do we mitigate that to reduce the impact on people's health?
That's an excellent question. What I can speak to is you're absolutely right that the first step is to characterize what the air quality is like, to actually get data, and that's where we come in as exposure scientists and as Health Canada. And I'll leave it to others on this call to kind of defend. But yes, our budget is very, appropriately, I think, spent to look where others do not and to represent the health interests of Canadians. And that's why we come and we do the research that we do, and we leverage all kinds of collaborations with academics. But putting that aside, the first step is to get the data. That's always the first step, and that's definitely what we're doing. But the part that increasingly is tied to that is thinking exactly what you're saying, is because we've been doing this, myself, but also our research group and others I work with for quite a number of years now. And so we have heard basically what you said, often directly from the communities. And it's quite often the case of we know, like we may not know the exact levels or the exact compounds, but we know, or at least strongly suspect, that there are some impacts, and maybe those impacts are actually higher here than there, and you're going to kind of quantify it and so on. But so what? Like, what's next? Can you help get them lower? That's really what most Canadians in these communities, and really all of us that want to be in clean air, want. So to that, what we try to do is really work on these relationships with the stakeholders, some of whom that I mentioned. So first of all, make the awareness that we're coming and we're collecting data. We share all our results. The data ultimately belongs to the public and ends up being available to the public for independent kind of use and analysis and so on. But mitigation specifically, I don't want to kind of go too far outside the data we've collected so far. I could say that we share with communities, even including the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. We plan to have outreach of our findings to that organization, because that's an example of an organization.
You froze for a second, Angelos. I don't know if you can still hear and see us, but you're frozen for us. Yeah, that's probably on his end. Well, hopefully he returns. But we are getting to the end of our time anyway. And like we have said about all our speakers, NB Lung can connect anybody who has more questions and who wants to hear more details about each of the presentations that we've heard. Melanie, did you want to close us out, or okay? Well, he probably can't hear us, but let's give a round of applause to Angelos.
Well, hopefully you can hear us, because that was an excellent presentation. I have so many questions, and maybe we can reconnect at another time. Okay, goodbye, the end. No. Thank you so much to everybody for being here. I wanted to also say a huge thanks to the NB Lung team for pulling this off. Awesome, awesome. An excellent roster of speakers and a very smooth event today. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure as the leader of a lung health charity to be able to pull together all of these partners that we work with in various spaces.
Okay, here we go.
Oh, are you back?
I am back. I don't even
You
know what
froze.
happened. I just got booted out. I got booted out. Internet seems to have gone down. Can you hear me okay? I
Yeah.
just want to give one substantive kind of quick answer to the mitigation aspect
Yeah,
for that
perfect.
very good question. I wanted to say simply that one of the things that as when we connect with our partners, especially those that look at land use guidelines, uh, I think one of the things to be looked at is the setback guidelines. There are setback guidelines that are specific to rail yards even. The question is, are they being applied everywhere, correctly? Should they be bigger? That's another question. But mitigation, and I'm happy to talk offline outside of this, mitigation by putting barriers and so on, that quickly, there's researchers that's all they do, engineers that look at that modeling, and it is not a super easy thing to put up a barrier and screen. You end up possibly concentrating results. So possibly one of the best things is simply to not get these land uses too close together, which historically it's been like that. Quite often the rail yard was where it was 100 years ago, it was in the middle of a farm field. And over time, we've grown our cities and sprawled them and come closer and closer. So maybe the mitigation angle, one of the angles that I think will be looked at by those that do this, is to say, well, let's look at the setback guidelines. Are they strong enough? Should they be bigger? Is there something else we can do for locations that already are there, and therefore you can't change it now? So now what do we do? So I agree. That's a very, very good question. It's one we've heard before, and it's the collaboration with our stakeholders and sharing what we find that I think will help answer that.
And we got
Anyways,
to the
thank you.
point just before you froze, where you said you were going to be sharing that data with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, and I think that's the key piece. We hear that a lot in New Brunswick, issues of that interface between industry and residential land use, that it's not something that the provincial government can regulate. It all comes down to land use planning, and that's a municipal issue. And really hard to undo something when you've already decided that this school can be in the same neighborhood as the rail line, as this industry and that industry. Hard to untangle that after the fact. So those land use planning considerations are super important in a go forward scenario. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody.
So next on my list of people to thank is our speakers. So Angelos, you just turned your camera off, but thank you so much to everybody who volunteered their time to speak and share their expertise on all of these various areas of air quality and how it interfaces with health. We couldn't, honestly, truly could not have put on an event like this without that volunteer participation. And also thank you for those online for sticking with us for a day and a half in a virtual event. I know sometimes that can be really dry, but we've had excellent engagement in the online chat. So that gives me hope that we've provided a really good experience for you, even if you weren't physically here in the room with us. So you will, as participants, both in the room and online, be getting a follow-up from us with a quick survey on your experience, and please give us another few minutes of your time and give us some feedback on that, because we do hope to be able to provide events like this in the future, and it's the feedback from your comments and the areas that you're interested in that enables us to put on the programming like we have done today. I'd like to also encourage you all to stay in touch with NB Lung. I've seen NB Lung and each other. I've seen some amazing connections being made across the room over the last day and a half, and NB Lung is always happy to be a connector of dots. So if you haven't signed up for our excellent newsletter, Dusty's in the back. We do have a newsletter that goes out once a month with a little bit of what's going on in our world and in our friends' worlds, social media, etc. We have a very strong presence there too. So most of the topics that we've talked about today tie into a program or another that NB Lung has on the go. We do play in a lot of different air quality sandboxes. So happy to make those connections. So I want to leave you with a quote from my favorite author. I love to read a lot. My favorite author is Dr. Seuss. And so the quote I want to leave you with is, unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. So thank you for the care that you bring to the air that we share. Let's continue to work together, make these connections, and to continue to protect this precious natural resource that we have, both indoors and out, for the benefit of all lungs and all people. Thank you so much. Safe travels home.